It happened fast, almost too fast for the market to react. Just last month, China officially announced a full suspension of all seafood imports from Japan. No warning period, no gradual reduction. One announcement and the door slammed shut. Within hours, seafood orders that had already been signed were canceled. Containers that were already on ships were stopped mid-route. Some shipments even reached Chinese ports, only to be sent straight back. For Japanese fishermen, this wasn't politics. It was personal. Imagine spending months raising seafood, harvesting it at peak quality, shipping it overseas, and then being told, no one will buy this anymore. That's exactly what happened. Industry estimates say Japan could lose over $500 million in just 1 year from this ban alone. For coastal communities that depend almost entirely on exports, that kind of loss is devastating. And this is how global supply chains really work. They're not abstract lines on a map. They're tightly timed systems. When one link breaks, the shock ripples outward. Processing plants stop, cold storage fills up, fishermen sit idle, and prices collapse overnight. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. While Japanese exporters were scrambling to limit losses, another country was quietly watching this unfold with interest. No emergency meetings, no public panic, just calculation. That country was India. To India's seafood exporters, China's decision looked less like a crisis and more like a rare opening. A major supplier had vanished overnight. A massive consumer market suddenly needed alternatives. And in global trade, moments like this don't come often. So the question immediately becomes bigger than Japan. When one supplier disappears overnight, who actually gets to replace them? That's the question we're going to investigate, because the answer is far less obvious than it first appears. To understand why India saw opportunity in Japan's loss, we need to look at what was happening on the other side of the world. For years, the United States was India's biggest seafood customer, buying roughly 1/3 of all Indian seafood exports. Frozen shrimp, in particular, flooded American supermarkets. Big retailers loved it. Cheap, consistent, and easy to scale. For Indian exporters, the U.S. market was the backbone of their entire industry. Then, that backbone cracked. After trade tensions escalated, the U.S. imposed 2 separate rounds of tariffs on Indian goods. 25% at first, then another 25% shortly after. Combined, Indian seafood entering the U.S. was suddenly hit with up to 50% in tariffs. That wiped out India's biggest advantage: overnight low prices. Think of it like this. If you're competing in a race because you're lighter and faster, and someone suddenly makes you carry a heavy backpack, you're no longer competitive. That's exactly what happened. American buyers began canceling contracts. New orders froze. Processing plants slowed down or shut entirely. Frozen shrimp was hit the hardest. These products had been staples for U.S. chains like Walmart. But once prices jumped due to tariffs, buyers simply walked away. In a single month, exports to the U.S. fell sharply, and millions of jobs tied to fishing, processing, packaging, and transport were suddenly at risk. So Indian exporters looked around and asked a simple question. Where else can we sell this volume? And the answer seemed obvious. China has a massive population. China imports billions of dollars worth of seafood every year. And now, Japan, the dominant supplier of premium seafood, was gone. From India's perspective, all the signs lined up: a huge Chinese market, a sudden supply vacuum, Japan out of the picture, the U.S. door slamming shut. On the surface, India's logic made sense. This wasn't wishful thinking, it was survival instinct. Any export-driven industry would think the same way. But here's the problem. Logical doesn't always mean realistic. To understand why, we need to take a closer look at what India actually brings to the table, and why, on paper, it looks far stronger than most people realize. That's where the story goes next. Before we talk about why India struggles to replace Japan, we first need to be fair. Because when it comes to natural conditions, India looks like a country that should be a seafood superpower. Start with geography. India is surrounded by ocean on three sides, with a coastline stretching over 7,500 kilometers. That alone puts it ahead of many major exporters. But it's not just about length, it's about where that coastline sits. To the west is the Arabian Sea, known for its higher salinity and suitability for large commercial fish species. To the east is the Bay of Bengal, one of the richest shrimp-producing waters in the world, packed with nutrients and warm currents. India sits right in the tropical zone, where marine life grows faster and species diversity is much higher than in colder regions. In simple terms, fish grow faster, harvest cycles are shorter, and output is easier to scale. Now add location. India sits next to the Indian Ocean, one of the world's busiest maritime highways. That means shorter shipping routes to Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia. Lower transport costs matter a lot in seafood, where freshness and fuel costs can decide profit or loss. The Indian government has also leaned into this advantage. Over the past decade, it has poured money into aquaculture farms, fishery bases, processing zones, cold chain infrastructure, export subsidies, and tax incentives. This wasn't accidental growth, it was policy-driven. And the numbers prove it worked, at least on the surface. In 2024, India exported about 1.7 million tons of seafood, worth roughly $7.4 billion. That makes India one of the world's largest seafood exporters by volume. So when Indian exporters look at China and think, why not us? They're not being delusional. They have scale. They have resources. They have experience shipping seafood across the world, which is exactly why the next part of the story matters. Because despite all these strengths, India runs into a hard limit when we shift from where seafood comes from to what kind of seafood people actually want to eat. And that's where the first real crack appears. Up to this point, India looks well positioned. Strong geography, huge output, global reach. But now we need to zoom in on something much more basic. What actually ends up on the dinner plate. Because in the Chinese market, seafood isn't just food. It's identity, status, and trust. For years, Japan occupied a very specific role in China's seafood supply. It wasn't about volume. It was about quality and perception. Japanese exports focused on high-value products, scallops, sea cucumbers, sea urchins, tuna, many of them sashimi grade. These are seafood items meant to be eaten raw or lightly prepared, where freshness and origin matter more than price. When Chinese consumers went to a Japanese restaurant, they didn't just order fish. They ordered Japanese fish, Hokkaido scallops, Pacific bluefin tuna. The country name itself functioned like a quality label. Now compare that to India. India's seafood exports are dominated by frozen shrimp, especially white leg shrimp. These products are designed for mass consumption. They go to supermarkets, wet markets, and large food processors. They compete on low prices, high volume, and standardized packaging. This isn't a criticism, it's a business model. But it's a very different one. Think of it like cars. Japan was selling luxury sedans to China's high-end buyers. India is producing affordable delivery vans for large fleets. Both are vehicles, but they serve completely different customers. So when Japan disappears from the Chinese market, India isn't stepping into the same lane. They're on a different road entirely. This is why the idea that India could simply replace Japan starts to break down. It's not about how much seafood India can produce. It's about whether its products belong in the same category as what China just lost. And once you understand that mismatch, another question becomes unavoidable. Even if India wanted to sell its shrimp to China, would China even need it? That's where the real tension begins. At this point, the problem for India is no longer Japan. The real problem is China itself. China isn't just the world's largest seafood consumer, it's also the world's largest seafood producer, especially in the exact category India relies on most white leg shrimp. This is where the story takes a sharp turn. India's flagship export, frozen white-leg shrimp, is already being produced inside China at enormous scale. Coastal provinces like Hainan, Guangdong, Fujian, Jiangsu, and Shandong have built massive, highly industrialized shrimp farming systems. These farms are standardized, automated, and deeply integrated with processing and logistics. The numbers are hard to ignore. China produces over 1.6 million tons of white-leg shrimp every year, accounting for about 38% of global output. That's not a gap, it's dominance. And because this production is domestic, China avoids import risks entirely. No tariffs, no port delays, no foreign exchange exposure, no geopolitical uncertainty. For mass-market seafood, this is exactly what policymakers and buyers prefer. So now imagine you're a Chinese importer. Would you buy frozen shrimp from overseas, paying shipping costs, taking quality risks, when local suppliers can deliver faster, cheaper, and with more predictable standards? This is why the question quietly changes. It's no longer, can India enter the Chinese market? It becomes, does China need India at all? For high-end seafood, China depends on imports. But for low and mid-range shrimp, the heart of India's export industry, China is already self-sufficient. And once demand disappears, no amount of supply can fix the problem. But even if China did want to import Indian seafood, there's one more barrier that's even harder to overcome than competition. That barrier is trust. And this is where India's challenge becomes truly structural. In the seafood business, trust matters more than price, especially in China. Chinese consumers are extremely sensitive to food safety. That sensitivity didn't come from nowhere. It was shaped by years of past scandals, strict media scrutiny, and increasingly tough government regulation. Today, if a product fails safety checks, it doesn't just get rejected, it gets remembered. This is where India runs into its biggest problem. India's seafood industry is highly fragmented. Around 70% of producers are small or medium-sized farms. Many operate on thin margins and simply can't afford advanced water purification systems, modern sanitation facilities, or full traceability standards. As a result, quality varies widely from batch to batch. These weaknesses show up most clearly in inspections. Indian seafood products have repeatedly been flagged in multiple countries for excessive antibiotic residues, and in some cases, substances that are outright banned. These aren't rare incidents, they're recurring patterns. Once a reputation like that forms, it's extremely difficult to reverse. Logistics make things worse. India's cold chain infrastructure, while improving, is still uneven. From farm to port, temperature control is often inconsistent. Industry estimates suggest transportation loss rates can reach up to 35%, meaning quality degradation long before the product even reaches customs. China has already acted on these concerns before. In 2022, Chinese authorities suspended 35 Indian seafood exporters over hygiene and safety violations. That decision sent a clear signal: market access is conditional, and standards are non-negotiable. For Chinese buyers, this history matters. When you're choosing seafood, especially imported seafood, the question isn't, is it cheap? It's, is it safe? By this point, the outcome is becoming clear. Even with Japan gone, and even with pressure from US tariffs, India faces too many structural barriers to fill the gap. And that leads us to the final twist in the story. Because China didn't leave the gap empty. It found another supplier, one that fits its needs far more precisely. While attention was focused on Japan's losses and India's ambitions, China was quietly doing what it always does in trade disputes, finding a practical replacement. That replacement wasn't India, it was Spain. At first glance, Spain might seem like an odd choice. It's far from Asia, has higher labor costs, and can't compete on volume with developing countries. But that's exactly the point. Spain wasn't chosen to replace volume. It was chosen to replace Japan's role. Spain specializes in high-value, premium seafood, especially bluefin tuna. Much of it comes from the Mediterranean and the North Atlantic, regions globally recognized for top-tier tuna quality. In southern Spain, fishermen still use an ancient method called almadraba, a trap net system that minimizes stress and damage to the fish. Tuna caught this way has better texture, richer fat content, and deeper color. Even Japan's sushi industry openly acknowledges that Spain produces the best bluefin tuna in Europe. Beyond the fish itself, Spain brings something China values deeply: system reliability. As an EU member state, Spain operates under some of the world's strictest food safety regulations. Cold chain logistics are standardized. Traceability systems are mature. Inspection and supervision are institutional, not optional. For Chinese regulators and importers, this dramatically lowers risk. There's also history. China and Spain already have a long-standing agricultural trade relationship. That trust didn't need to be built. It already existed. The results showed up quickly. In the first 10 months of 2025, seafood imports from Spain through just the Shenzhen port reached roughly 100 million yuan, a 47.3% year-on-year increase. And that's only one port. This time, China also approved a wider range of Spanish products, including salmon, grouper, oysters, and even white-leg shrimp, covering both premium dining and broader consumer demand. In other words, Spain didn't just step into Japan's shoes, it fit them. By now, the conclusion is almost unavoidable. India wasn't rejected because of politics or timing. It was sidelined because the structure of its industry doesn't match what China needs. And that brings us to the final question, not just about India, but about global trade itself. What does this entire episode actually teach us? That's where we end the story. At first glance, China's ban on Japanese seafood looked like a golden opportunity. A major supplier disappeared overnight. Billions of dollars in demand suddenly needed a new source. For exporters watching from the outside, especially India, it felt like a door had finally opened. But this story shows why trade vacuums are often an illusion. In global markets, the winner isn't the country that produces the most or the one that's most eager to sell. It's the one whose products, standards, and reputation already match the buyer's needs. Japan didn't lose its position because of price. It lost it because of politics. But it was replaced by a supplier that could meet the same expectations. India's challenge wasn't ambition, it was structure. India specializes in large-volume, price-sensitive seafood. China, in this moment, needed premium, trusted, traceable products. On top of that, China already produces massive quantities of the very shrimp India depends on. When you add quality concerns, cold chain weaknesses, and regulatory history, the gap becomes impossible to ignore. This doesn't mean India's seafood industry is doomed. It means the path forward is harder than many expect. Without major upgrades in quality control, sanitation, traceability, and cold chain infrastructure, new markets will remain out of reach, no matter how big they look on paper. The real lesson here goes beyond seafood. Global trade today is less about who can supply the fastest and more about who can earn trust over time. That's a slow process. And there are no shortcuts. So now I want to ask you, how do you evaluate India's seafood future? Can it move up the value chain, or will it remain locked into price competition? If you found this breakdown useful, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We'll continue digging into stories where geopolitics, economics, and real-world industries collide. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.